Joe Exotic officially facing life in prison after this.
I'm pretty much comfortable with Joe Exotic. It's like I drive down the interstate and everybody's like, Joe Exotic.
Few news stories have caught our attention during these troubling times, yet the life of Joe Exotic has taken hold and doesn't plan to let go anytime soon. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Before we begin, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out the link in the description to enter a chance at winning our Apple product giveaway. Oklahoma's largest big cat owner, Joe Exotic, has led an interesting life, to say the least, and after the release of the Netflix docuseries, Tiger King, his story has become the most talked about topic in the nation. What began as an aspiration to bring joy and education to people through animals ended up the largest big cat exhibit in the nation. Yet according to the self-proclaimed Tiger King, as his kingdom expanded, enemies near and far laid his empire to waste due to jealousy. With his life's work crumbling, Joe took to extreme measures to protect his zoo, which ultimately cost him his freedom. Thanks again for tuning in. Today on Lime Report, we'll be taking a closer look at Joe Exotic's wild tale and how it landed him the opportunity to experience a life in captivity. Don't go anywhere as things get more and more interesting. For those of you who have yet to check out Tiger King, the Netflix documentary series starring Joe Exotic, here's the quick version. Joe Exotic fell in love with exotic cats while recovering from a failed suicide attempt. Joe broke his back in an attempt to take his life and ended up in Florida for his rehabilitation process. It was there where he met the owner of Lion Country Safari, who would bring home baby lions and monkeys at night and let Joe feed the cubs, fostering his love for animals. After the experience, Joe began his quest to create his own big cat sanctuary in order to care for his newfound love. However, that decision would end up becoming one of the gravest mistakes he's ever made. With enemies aplenty lurking in the shadows, Joe became increasingly more paranoid at every turn. The thought of being under constant siege combined with his increased financial burden led the zoo owner to take drastic measures. However, his devious plan blew up in his face and threatened to leave Joe spending the rest of his days in prison. What scheme did Joe cook up in an effort to save his tiger sanctuary? Find out next as we uncover Joe Exotic's dark past. Joe began his big cat safe haven in 1999 on a 16-acre flat of land. When he bought the space, he originally intended to build a new farm for his family. However, after falling in love with exotic animals, he shifted his focus and founded the Greater Wynnewood Exotic Animal Park in honor of his brother, whose dream was to see tigers in Africa before his tragic death. Thus, Joe's legacy, as well as his troubles, began. After 7 years of owning and operating his big cat sanctuary, sometimes known as GW Zoo, his nemesis appeared in a news article bashing his zoo. In a piece condemning Joe's zoo and others like it, Big Cat's Rescue CEO claimed Joe was only using his sanctuary to breed and profit off of his animals. The article set Joe off, igniting a bitter rivalry between Joe and Carole that would last over 10 years before the flame would seemingly dissipate. During their insane feud, both sides constantly belittled each other and did everything in their power to try and ruin the other's reputation. While Carole campaigned to have Joe and other private zoos like his shut down, he had something much more malicious in mind for his enemy. With his hatred for Carole growing by the day, Joe took to extreme measures to quiet the voices of his detractors. Keep watching as we uncover what Joe had in store for his bitter enemy and how his nefarious scheme backfired, leaving Joe to face decades in prison. You won't want to miss any of this. Joe had plenty of problems to deal with before Carole appeared, and her presence only made things worse for the zoo owner. While Joe was able to keep the GW Zoo open for 20 years, he was constantly having to come up with new ways to make money to keep the doors open. According to Joe, the annual cost to feed just one tiger was around $3,000, and with over 200 big cats in his sanctuary, the bill ran up to $750,000 just to feed his animals. As Joe was running out of ideas, he looked to fellow big cat enthusiast Doc Annell to steal ideas from his zoo, Myrtle Beach Safari. What Exotic found was a genius idea revolving completely around tiger cubs and how to include them for major profits. After beginning his own tiger cub attractions in the zoo as well as allegedly selling the cubs, Joe managed to make enough to keep his zoo open as well as keep a small profit. Yet this smart business move would prove to be the beginning of the end for Exotic. His actions were immediately met with backlash from animal rights activists, and with the looming threat from his rival, the Tiger King was pushed to the brink of madness. Joe and Carole wanted nothing more than for the other to disappear. Carole wanted to put Joe and other private zoos out of business, while Joe, on the other hand, had a different strategy in mind to win the war, one that he attempted multiple times. After years of harassment from Carole as well as PETA, who eventually teamed up to take Joe down, the Oklahoma-based cat enthusiast had enough. That's when he came up with a plan to silence his enemy once and for all by killing her. Joe hosted a web show every night at 6 p.m. and would often talk about his hatred for Carole and all those against him. In one episode, he stated that he believed before Carole or anyone else was able to shut him down, they would stop breathing first. The statement rang out as an eerie threat, and Joe attempted to make good on his word several occasions. His first attempt at Carole's life was malicious, yet passive. One year, a month before her birthday, Joe decided to ship 2 venomous snakes to Carole's home in Florida in hopes they would jump out of her mailbox and kill her. While the attempt failed, Joe didn't stop there. Soon after, as things escalated between the two, as he was already hemorrhaging money before Carole's arrival, her activism caused Joe to lose business as well, further worsening his financial state. As his exotic sanctuary lurched closer to a bitter end, Joe decided to turn up the heat and take a more active approach to silence his detractors. After his first attempt on Carole's life failed, Joe sought out a professional to take care of the job for him. In his search, he eventually found Alan Glover, and the two struck a deal. In November 2017, he gave Alan Glover $3,000 to travel from Oklahoma to Florida to carry out the murder. Yet, just before his fight, Glover backed out, took the money, and disappeared. Yet that didn't stop Joe as he continued his search for a proper hitman, hoping that he would find someone willing to take his enemy's life. Then, just a month later, he found another individual willing to carry out the hit, or so he thought. However, what Joe didn't know was that this particular gun for hire was actually a federal agent aiming to put Joe behind bars. Joe had been under federal investigation for quite some time, and this was finally their chance to bring the Tiger King down. Or it would have been, but no money was exchanged during their meeting. Luckily for authorities, the previous hitman Glover appeared to testify against Joe, allowing federal agents to arrest him. When his case was first brought to court, prosecutors sought out the highest possible sentence for Joe Exotic, reportedly threatening to imprison him for 80 years. Yet Joe was unfazed.
"Death doesn't scare me,"
he said in the first episode regarding the threats.
"I walked into a tiger's cage every single day at work, prepared to die."
Despite their best attempts to seal his fate before a trial could begin, Joe pled not guilty in hopes that his defense team would be able to clear his name. However, after a 47-minute conversation was played out for the jury in which Exotic and the agent posing as a gun for hire discussed the terms of their agreement, things seemed to be all but lost for the 57-year-old zookeeper. In the recording, Exotic could be heard detailing the plan in which the undercover agent would follow before he would be paid. While Exotic's defense said their client wasn't being serious, the testimony by hitman for hire Alan Glover, the man that previously ghosted Joe and ran off with his money, was the final nail in the coffin for Joe. Found guilty, rather than the 80 years in prison he was threatened with, Joe Exotic was found guilty and charged with 2 counts of murder for hire in addition to 8 counts of violating the Lacey Act for falsifying wildlife records and 9 counts of violating the Endangered Species Act, according to U.S. Attorney Timothy J. Downing, a member of the prosecution. With his guilty sentence, Joe faces 22 years in prison with another 3 years of supervised release afterwards. He will be 79 when he is finally released from prison. When Tiger King was first released, everyone believed the documentary series would prove to be beneficial for big cats in the way that the docuseries Blackfish was for orcas by showing the public the truth about the ruthless killer whale trade. However, what most thought would be a show to help the gravely endangered animals, Tiger King turned out to be a drama-filled series that brought out the worst in people and proved only one thing: those who own exotic animals are crazier than their pets. Yet it must be said that for how much trouble Joe was able to get himself into, it's amazing that he was able to keep his supposed tiger sanctuary open for so long. After his arrest and subsequent guilty sentence, many worried what would become of his hundreds of animals previously in his care. Luckily, a few years before the incident, Joe was in another financial crisis when angel investor and fellow big cat lover Jeff Lowe decided to help Joe and invest in his business. With the move, Joe put the business in Jeff's name and stayed on board as a director of entertainment for legal purposes. Thanks to the savvy business move, the Greater Wynnewood Exotic Animal Park was able to keep its doors open. Things seem all but lost for Joe Exotic now. He's lost his home, his cats, and now his freedom. Nevertheless, in a hopeful message from the now infamous star, Joe has informed the world that he plans to fight the injustice of his imprisonment from behind bars. What do you think will become of Joe Exotic now that he's behind bars? Will he spend the rest of his life behind bars? Will Joe be able to fight back and make his way back to his zoo? Or does imprisonment mean that Carole Baskin has finally won their ridiculous decade-long feud? Tell us how you feel in the comments section below. Thanks for joining us on Line Report, everyone. Oh, and before you go, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out the link in the description to enter a chance at winning our Apple product giveaway.